Hey everyone, welcome back to the Dental Wolf YouTube channel. I cannot tell you how excited I am for this video. So everything that I've been doing with the Dental Wolf and all the videos that we've produced so far have all been leading up to this point, which is practice valuation. So today we're going to dive into a brief introduction of what practice valuations are, and then in following videos we're going to show you how to dive into valuations yourself. Now before I dive in too deep into this, I want to make it clear that the point of this video isn't to give you all the skills that you need to value practices on your own. You're going to want to hire a dental specific CPA and a lawyer in order to properly value your practices. So there are three main approaches to valuing a business. They are the market approach, the income approach, and the asset approach. So the market approach is very similar to how you do real estate. You're going to look for comparable items in the market and base your valuation off of those. So for example, when you're looking at buying a house, the way they determine the value of the house that you're buying is they'll look at other homes that have sold in the area that are comparable to the one that you're looking at. This is great for real estate, but it doesn't necessarily always work for dentistry. Let's say you're buying a practice in a rural area where there aren't many other dental practices, or other practices haven't sold recently. It'd be very difficult to determine the value of that practice based on past purchases. So then we look at valuing a practice as a business or based on its income. Based on the cash flows that it's been providing the current owner, what is it now worth to the new dentist that's coming in to purchase that practice? And this is going to be the main way that you are going to value practices in dentistry. But let's say that the practice that you're looking to buy doesn't have a steady income stream. How do you value it then? Well, then the only way left that you can value that practice is basically based on the asset values of that practice. So you're going to look at the building, the dental chairs, the tools, basically all of the office assets that that practice has. Add those values together, and then you're going to buy that practice based on the overall asset value. So we're going to focus mainly on the income approach, and there's a few ways this can be done. The first way that we're going to talk about is the max loan approach. This approach basically says what is the most you should pay for a practice according to the cash flow, or what is the most you can pay for a practice based on its ability to repay the business loan that you're going to receive. So the first part of using the max loan approach is that you're going to find the maximum loan payment that this practice could handle given its current cash flow. So the way you do this is you're going to take EBITDA and you're going to divide EBITDA by 12, and that's going to give you the cash available each month for debt service. And then you're going to use a financial calculator, and if you don't know how to do this, it's fine. Banks will basically do this for you, but you're going to need to know how long the loan would be. Typically they're between 7 to 10 years. You're going to need to know the interest rate that the loan would be for, and then you're going to use the payment or the monthly cash available that you calculated by dividing EBITDA by 12. Well, let's look at a sample practice. Let's say this practice is collecting $700,000 a year and it has 70% overhead, so its operating income is $210,000. The doctor's salary is about $150,000 and EBITDA is $60,000 a year. So we're going to take EBITDA and we're going to divide it by 12, and that's going to give us $5,000 a month. This is the maximum monthly payment that this practice can handle, assuming that we're not sacrificing the doctor's salary to pay off the debt service. Basically, you're sacrificing your income as an owner to pay off the debt service, but you're still walking home with $150,000 a year. So let's look at this example a little further. So let's say you have a 7-year loan at a 7% interest. This would mean that the most you should pay for this practice is $331,000 a year. And this is the most you should pay because if you paid more for this practice than $331,000, you'd be sacrificing your salary as a doctor or your daily working value as a doctor to pay off your debt service. In other words, if you're not producing dentistry, you're not paying your loans. So the main use of this number is to determine the max amount that you should be willing to pay, given the assumptions that you're not willing to sacrifice your doctor's salary. So now let's look at a new way of valuing a practice, which is percent of collections. This is a very common way of valuing practices. And typically the practice purchase price is going to be anywhere between 65 and 75% of the total collections. So for this particular practice, the purchase price is estimated to be between $455,000 and $525,000. Now there is a problem with this valuation method, and to explore what that problem is, let's take the example of a second practice. So let's say this other practice is collecting $700,000 a year, but it only has 50% overhead, so its operating income is $350,000 a year, and the doctor's still making $150,000, but your EBITDA, or the owner income, is $200,000 a year. So you could look at both of those practices, and using this method, they'd both value for between the range of $455,000 and $525,000. But which would you rather buy? Which one would you be willing to pay more for? So that brings us to our next valuation method, which is multiple of earnings. So this valuation method takes your operating income, or your earnings, and multiplies it by between 1.3 and 2.2. So let's take our second practice again and now compare the two. So the second practice again has an operating income of $350,000 because its overhead is much lower and has a much higher EBITDA. So practice 1 using this method would be valued between $273,000 and $462,000. Practice 2, on the other hand, would be valued at $455,000 to $770,000. The last method that we should talk about is the EBITDA multiple. Now, in my opinion, this method is probably one of the best because it represents what this practice would mean to an investor, not only to a dentist, but to an investor. And if you haven't seen the video on cap rates or EBITDA multiples yet, feel free to look that up in the description down below. So typically, the price of a practice will range anywhere between 2.5 and 4 times the EBITDA. Another way to look at this is your cap rate for your practice should be anywhere between 25% and 40%. So let's look at the second practice to understand this. So again, you have practice 1 has a high overhead, practice 2 has a lower overhead, and therefore their EBITDAs or their owner earnings are different. So practice 1 using this method would value between $150,000 and $240,000. In practice 2 would value between $500,000 and $800,000. So just as a means of review, we talked about the main different approaches to valuing a business or a practice. They are the market approach, the income approach, and the asset approach. And the main approach that's going to be used, and probably the best approach, is going to be that income approach. So now we're going to take our 2 sample practices and let's run through the numbers and see how they compare. So using our max loan approach, the most you should pay for practice number 1 is $331,000. And the most you should pay for practice number 2 is $1.1 million. Using our percent of collection approach, they're both going to be the same. They're both going to be the same on paper because they both are having the same amount of collections. If we were to look at an earnings multiplier, practice number 1 would value for between $273,000 and $462,000. And practice number 2 would value much higher at $455,000 to $770,000. And if we were to look at our EBITDA multiplier, practice number 1 would value between $150,000 and $240,000. And practice number 2 would value between $500,000 and $800,000. So there's probably still a few questions that you're wondering about in your head. The first question is, wow, look at this range. On the low end, we could be paying $150,000 for this. And on the high end, we're probably paying around $525,000. So what's the real price of this practice? Well, the truth is there isn't an exact price. The price of that practice is whatever price the seller is willing to sell it for and somebody else is willing to buy it for. Really, the price is anywhere in between that range where both the seller and the buyer feel comfortable. This is why it's so important to have good people on your team, like a dental accountant and a dental lawyer, to help you negotiate that price in a way that's fair for both parties. The other question that you should be asking is, if the max loan that I can get is $331,000, but the ranges of what's possible to pay for this practice are much higher, what does that look like? Well, let's say you go in and the person selling this practice is asking $400,000 for it, and there's no negotiating. That's the minimum that they're going to let this practice go for. A bank is probably only going to be willing to lend $330,000 based on the financials of this practice. So you basically have two options at that point. You can either fund the $70,000 yourself by saving before you go to purchase that practice, or you can get seller financing. So what seller financing is it requires the seller to carry the balance of the loan. Or in other words, you're going to owe the bank $330,000 and you'll owe the seller $70,000. And there's a lot of ways you can structure that. You can pay the seller in payments and installments over a period of time, or you might just pay them in a giant lump sum at some time in the future with interest. Sometimes banks don't mind this, and the reason why is because the seller now has skin in the game. They now have invested in your success as the new dental owner because they want to get paid. So they will do everything they can to help you be successful so that they can get the rest of their money plus interest. So I had a ton of fun researching and studying and trying to understand valuations. The more I studied it, the more I realized that you really need good people on your side to help you in this process. It would be really easy for a dental student to make the mistake of thinking that if they just got the right spreadsheet and plugged in all the numbers, they could figure out exactly what to pay for a practice. But the truth is, you probably want an accountant or a lawyer to help advise you on what the wisest decision would be. So the purpose and the main takeaway of this video should be a greater understanding of how valuations occur and to help you weed through some purchasing opportunities so that you can find your diamond in the rough, the perfect practice for you, exactly what you're looking for, and within the price range that you're looking for. So it would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge a few resources that I had while I was studying and trying to understand this. The first one would be David Gandy's book, Secrets to Buying Your Ideal Dental Practice. It was a great book for the price that I paid for. I think I only paid $5 or $6, and it's a 50-page book, and it was just full of little golden nuggets. And I really gleaned a lot of good information out of this book while putting together this presentation. The other book I want to acknowledge is How to Buy a Dental Practice by Brian Hanks. He does an awesome job of leading you step by step through the purchasing of a practice. I would highly recommend this book to anyone who's listening. I've really enjoyed reading this book so far, and it's helped me understand a lot better the process of buying a dental practice. And finally, I can't believe I have not talked about shared practices yet in these videos, but the Shared Practices podcast is gold for any pre-owner. If you are a pre-owner looking to buy a practice anytime in the future, you should be listening to the Shared Practices podcast. There's so much that I've learned from shared practices over the last 2 years of dental school. So I will leave a link to each of these resources that I've used in the description down below. None of these links are affiliate links. I'm not sponsored by any of the people who wrote these books or run the podcast. I just genuinely feel that each of these resources is worth investing into. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that video. This is exciting because we're actually starting to dive into practice valuations, and this is where the hard skills actually start to develop for dental practice pre-owners. If you can understand how valuations work, you're going to be able to have much more intelligent conversations with the people that you work with the seller, the brokers, the accountants, the lawyers, everyone that's involved in the purchasing of a practice. If there's any of the terms that you didn't understand in this video, I highly recommend going through our terminology series and seeing if you can't find the term there. And if you can't, and you'd like to learn more, please leave a comment down below and we will make a video explaining the terminology that you don't understand. Thank you to everyone who's been watching. It's been fun to see the video series grow, and feel free to email us at dentalwolfonline@gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.